This is Jed Disler, and welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. A listener recently suggested that I come up with a list of what I thought would be the best and the worst releases in the Hyperion label's still very much in progress and quite extensive Romantic Piano Concerto edition. And I think that he meant that he wanted me to mention the best works as well as the worst works, meaning pieces that were not worth learning and recording and not worthy of the time and the talents of many of the participating pianists. But I'm usually hesitant to come up with lists of things like the least interesting compositions represented in a series, because, for starters, I never think that it's a good idea to devote time and effort to something negative, especially a lot of time and effort and research to something that's basically negative. But what if I focus instead on, let's say, 5 releases in this series that feature worthwhile music and persuasive performances? I think that would be a much better way to guide listeners who are just getting started with the Hyperion Romantic Concerto series, or for those collectors who are curious about the series yet don't know where to start. And I could see why it would be kind of daunting to know where to start because there are so many volumes. Now, I'm going to avoid on this episode talking about better-known repertoire that's in the series, such as the Tchaikovsky concertos or the Rachmaninoff concertos, because I think it's more valuable to focus on lesser-known, yet still very interesting and worthwhile compositions. I'm also limiting myself to 5 releases for this talk, for this episode, mainly so that I don't have to repeat any pianists. So we will talk about 5 pianists as well as 5 releases, because in this series there are some pianists who crop up time and again. So we're going to start with my first suggestion, my first of 5 recommendations, and this is volume 42 in the series. It features 2 concertos, the Piano Concerto in D major by Evnes and the Piano Concerto in D-flat major by Christian Sinding. And these are performed by Piers Lane at the piano and Andrew Litton conducting the Bergen Symphony Orchestra. When it came to large forms, Christian Sinding was not exactly a great master. And it probably says a lot that when you live into your 80s and you compose prolifically, and the only piece of yours that has wound up staying in the repertoire is a little piano miniature called Rustle of Spring. Well, if that's the case, then obviously there's something wrong. But I do have to say that in this concerto that Sinding wrote when he was very young, there are tons of lovely tunes, and yeah, it's true that the structure goes all over the place, but you know, we love George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, and that has kind of a loosey-goosey structure, but all of the tunes are unbelievably memorable. So, you know, in this sense, you gotta cut Christian Sinding some slack because he's such a tunesmith, and his music falls so easily and delightfully on the ear. This is coupled with a piano concerto by Evnes, who lived from 1872 until 1932. He was a Norwegian composer, pianist, organist, and choir director, and a teacher and administrator, and he had his hands in many pockets, and he didn't have time, obviously, to turn out tons of music. But his piano concerto is kind of remarkable. On one hand, it has a lighthearted and extroverted quality that would make this work a worthy contender on any self-respecting pops concert, maybe. But the problem, or maybe it isn't a problem, but the issue is that the orchestra is immense. It's almost Wagnerian and Richard Straussian in its size and scope. The waltz finale of this concerto is pure Hollywood in an age before Hollywood. And if you can imagine the MGM studio orchestra with a full array of trombones and more brass instruments that can fit into the studio, it's kind of like that. This is a delicious work. So actually, I might as well recommend this disc as a good first choice if you want to take a deep dive into the Hyperion Romantic Piano Concerto series. Start with this disc, perhaps. For my second disc, I recommend volume 55. This contains works for piano and orchestra by Charles-Marie Vidor. He lived from 1844 to 1937, a nice long life. Of course, Vidor was best known as a virtuoso organist in the French Romantic tradition, and also for composing numerous virtuoso organ works. He has all those great organ symphonies. But he also wrote very effectively for the piano. His Piano Concerto No. 1 in F minor, Opus 39, has a propulsive quality in the first movement that sometimes reminds me of Schumann. I'm thinking about those short, obsessively yearning phrases and those rising sequences. They're very Schumann-esque in a way. The central Adagio Religioso movement exchanges unison orchestral lines with chordal passages from the piano. This is very much in the manner of the slow movement of Beethoven's Fourth Concerto, but, imitation is the best form of flattery, and, if you need a role model, you might as well use Beethoven's Fourth. And the finale's main theme actually is quite similar to the last movement of Schumann's Carnival, but Vidor's piano writing is more glittery on the surface than Schumann's piano writing and more symmetrical. So in this case, it's actually closer to Saint-Saëns. Now, Vidor's fantasy for piano and orchestra on this disc, it's a work in one movement, and it's unabashedly romantic in its extroverted sweep. I think Tchaikovsky would have really identified with this piece. But the Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, Opus 77, is kind of like what César Franck might have been composing had he lived an extra 20 years, and that's a compliment. This is a work that's harmonically dense, but it's not sludgy, and the orchestration is lush without being overloaded, and there's a lot of cool woodwind writing throughout. The pianist on this disc, Marcus Becker, doesn't fluff off this music at all. He really takes Vidor's keyboard writing very seriously, and he leaves no detail to chance. He plays this music with so much command and authority. It really impresses me. Also, I'm impressed with the superb conducting of Thierry Fisher, who leads the BBC National Orchestra of Wales. And this orchestra turns up in many of the Hyperion Romantic Concerto volumes. Now for my third recommendation. Volume 18 has at least one work that is sort of familiar. This is the Concerto for Piano Left Hand and Orchestra by Erich Wolfgang Cornold. He wrote this around 1922 or 1923 for Paul Wittgenstein. He was that pianist who lost his right arm during World War I, and he commissioned all of these composers like Prokofiev. He commissioned the Fourth Concerto. He commissioned the Ravel Concerto for Left Hand. Now, because Wittgenstein owned the performing rights for this piece, no one else could touch it until after he died. After Wittgenstein died in 1961. This is a work in one continuous movement, and it abounds with all kinds of lavish harmonies and interesting orchestral passages and first desk soloists. There have been some very fine recordings of this work. There was a really good recent one with Matthias Halverson recently. Howard Shelley's recording on Chandos is also excellent. The late Stephen de Groot did a recording that came out on CPO, which I have not heard, but I hear that it's not the greatest one. But it's too bad that Gary Graffman did not make a commercial recording of the Cornold, because he did play it in public. There is a wonderful live performance with him from 1985 with Zubin Mehta conducting, and that's floating around YouTube, and I've posted a link to that. However, with the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra again, this time under Osmo Vanska, the piano soloist is the great Marc-Andre Hamelin, and his left hand is as good as the best two right hands in the world combined. And this recording is a real reference. It's just fantastic on every level. And also the coupling is a reference recording, and it's a marvelous work. The Romantic Piano Concerto by the Austrian composer Joseph Marx, who lived from 1882 until 1964. I remember reading somewhere that Simon Rattle called Messiaen's Tarangalila Symphony a Mars bar of a piece. Well, if that's the case, then the positively seductive early 20th century romantic idioms that Joseph Marx combines in his concerto fuse the sensual landscapes of Delius, the swirling piano writing of Rachmaninoff, Erich Korngold's amazing facility, and also the fast-changing colors of Respighi's orchestration. They're all blended into the biggest, most humongous dessert you'll ever find. Forget a Mars bar. I mean, this is a kind of a sweet that even Willy Wonka never could have concocted had he had all the chocolate machines in the world cranking out product 24 hours a day. And this first commercial recording of the Romantic Piano Concerto of Marx on Volume 18 in the Hyperion series, I think is still the best one out there. Now, if you go on YouTube, you'll find a live 1982 performance with George Boulette, and again, Zubin Mehta is the conductor. And I attended this performance, at least one of the performances in the run of concerts that they did. And it was really quite a discovery when Boulette brought this piece to light. I don't think it had ever been played in New York before he played it, so far as I know. And I hope that the live Boulette broadcast will eventually be issued commercially and officially, but from my mouth to God's ear. But anyway, this Cornold and Marx Volume 18 is a keeper, and this is the third recommendation on my Hyperion Romantic Concerto list. Now, for my fourth recommendation, we go back to France, and we have a really unusual project here. These are all works of Charles Gounod for orchestra and pedal piano. These are all disc premieres, by the way. This is Volume 62 I'm talking about. And the piano soloist is my good friend Roberto Proceda. He's one of the most enterprising pianists around. You have to check out his complete Mozart and Mendelssohn solo piano cycles on Decca. They are reference versions for sure. Anyway, these Gounod recordings on Hyperion, Roberto Proceda did not have an authentic period instrument pedal piano on hand. So what he did for this recording was to use an Italian-made pedal gadget to stack up two Steinway Grands with one atop the other so that the pedal mechanism would be relegated to the bottom keyboard. So consequently, Roberto had to develop a whole new technique in order to master this behemoth of a instrument, a real wild beast, to be sure. For example, you cannot use the sustain pedal when your feet are otherwise engaged playing notes on the, organ-like pedal, the thing for the pedal piano. However, it sounds as if he has been playing this contraption forever. And I think the results were totally worth it because the music is just wonderful. You have this suite concertante in 4 movements, which really could be a ballet score, and then the piano concerto in 4 brief and succinct movements. I love this piece. And there's the fantasy on the Russian national anthem, and here, of course, you'll recognize the main tune because you've heard it all the time in Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture and March Slav. And Howard Shelley is the conductor on this disc, and he leads the Orchestra della Svizzera Italiana, and they just play like crazy for him. My 5th recommendation to help you get started in the Hyperion Romantic Piano Concerto series. Now, there had been previous recordings for the 2 piano concertos by the Swedish composer Wilhelm Stenhammar, but the performances on Volume 49 in the Hyperion series with pianist Seta Tanyel, I think, are the best ones of the Stenhammar concertos that we have in the catalog. Stenhammar lived from 1871 to 1927, and he was an active conductor as well as pianist, and he wrote some truly idiomatic and very engaging works for piano, including his 2 concertos. As a pianist, Stenhammar made his debut playing the Brahms Piano Concerto No. 1 in D minor when he was just 22, and he wrote his own first concerto a year later, performing it under such distinctive conductors like Hans Richter and Richard Strauss. And Brahms' influence, I think, really informs Stenhammar's formal ambitions, as well as his love for big chords and octave passages that are not show-offy, if you know what I mean. But the second movement, Vivacissimo, in the first concerto, owes more than just a little bit of champagne-like effervescence to Saint-Saëns. And you can say the same for the second concerto scherzo movement, which is very much like an effervescent Saint-Saëns movement. This concerto is fantastic as well. And I can say that Seta Tanyel's naturally singing tone and big and flexible technique do both of these concertos total justice. And this pianist has wonderful support from Andrew Maines, conducting the Helsingborg Symphony Orchestra, and he balances the woodwinds forward, as he should in this music, and the strings really resonate and speak much more than in the other recordings of these pieces. Also, Andrew Mainsey's informative booklet notes are written in a style that's both erudite and entertaining at the same time, and these are really wonderful to have. So that's a wrap. 5 CD releases in Hyperion's Romantic Piano Concerto series that I think will help you get started in this series if you have not yet explored it. Now, there are so many other discs in the series that I could have picked that I love equally as much, but I figured let's focus on a nice variety of relatively unfamiliar works and 5 different pianists just to get you started. I'm sure that I can pick 5 more equally compelling and recommendable contenders for another episode of The Piano Maven, your friendly guide to piano recordings, but that will have to wait until another episode. So, thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to being with you next time.